welcome to this episode of the Uncharted Sounds podcast. I'm here again with my good mate Noel. How you doing, Noel?
Very good, mate. Very good.
So today, Noel, today's episode, we're going to feature the band Rialto.
In a skyscraper, in a skyscraper's where I want to live, with no elevator, at the top of the stairs where nobody else is. I don't want any trouble in my little bubble. Up above the clouds, looking at the clouds out on the ground, watching from the steeple all the little people running round. Lock the door behind me, no one's gonna find me to bring me down. In a skyscraper, we'll send for the papers every now and then.
Have you heard of Rialto?
You know what? I've seen Rialto, and I think I saw them with you, actually, supporting Echo Belly. But I'll be really honest, to my shame, I don't really know a lot about them, certainly not as much as you do. But what I have done is I have done a little bit of a look up on some of their live gigs to throw into our conversation.
Okay, brilliant. So we are going to be talking to Louis Eliot, who's later on in the episode, who was the sort of lead vocalist, guitar and songwriter of Rialto. So, but I thought let's just have a little run through there, as like we normally do with their biography. And of course, for those that are listening, if you're listening for the first time, if you get the opportunity to subscribe to the podcast or to leave a 5-star review, then that would also be gratefully received by us all. So let's get back to Rialto. So Noel, they formed in London in 97 and they released a self-titled album a year later in 98. But then they released a second and final album in 2001 called Night on Earth. So they're sort of quite short-lived as a band.
Yeah.
Although there is a bit of a story coming, so we'll get to that. But they did get to number 20 in the charts with their single Untouchable.
If you were an angel, I would cut off your wings to keep you with me. I would do anything, like broken bottles that slip from drunken hands. I've watched my star falling and shatter on the ground. First you wash your hair, then you wash your hands. Oh yeah, I think I understand. Untouchable if I'm not fit to even crawl if I'm too sick. I'll soak my skin in alcohol until I feel untouchable. Untouchable if I'm not fit to even crawl if I'm too sick.
And that was back in 1998. And interestingly enough, they were also the first UK chart band to release a single exclusively through the internet.
Well, that's a claim to fame.
So that's a sort of a bit of an interesting point about them. So let's just whiz through their lineup. It was basically, as I said, Louis Eliot, as I said, who we're going to be talking to, Johnny Bull on guitar and backing vocals, and obviously did a bit of producing as well. Julian Taylor on bass, Pete Cuthbert on drums, and then from 1997, Toby Hounsham. He stayed in the band for 3 years, but Toby Hounsham now plays keyboards in the Stranglers. Apparently, Toby was like a bit of a Dave Greenfield disciple.
Right, yeah, brilliant.
So, and I've seen the band a few times with him in it now. It's incredible how seamless he slipped into that band, because obviously the keyboards are a massive sound of the
Stranglers,
of the
massive.
Stranglers. And just the last guy, Anthony Christmas on drums, who also was in the band from 97 to 2000.
So my understanding is they fell out of an earlier band called Kinky Machines, which Louis and Johnny and Anthony were in.
They absolutely did. You're right. Actually, it was Louis Elliot, Johnny, and Anthony Christmas were in Kinky Machine, and
Yeah.
actually they released a couple of albums as well. They were on a record label called East West Records, and they then had a song called London Crawling, which interestingly enough, Rialto then recorded for their second album, Night on Earth.
Clever play on words from London Calling.
That's sort of in the early to mid 90s, 93 to 95. Then you've got into 97, as with a number of the bands, as I said, their bassist was changed, the drummer was changed, the keyboardist was changed. So they then, in 97, they released their first single, When We're Together.
The lights come on, I track her moves, locking the door, crossing the room. She's on the phone again, and when she laughs, I feel my blood rushing. I feel my blood rush to my heart. I call her up and disconnect. Wait by her house once more to check. Stare through the window of the kitchenette, and then I follow her down underground escalators, hiding behind my newspaper until the time when we're together.
Now, they also released in that year Monday Morning 519, which actually made the UK charts in number 37, which for me was probably one of their sort of definitive songs. I would guess they may disagree with that, but we can talk to Louis later. But for me, it was a really good song.
At 8 o'clock we said goodbye. That's when I left her house for mine. She said that she'd be staying in. Well, she had to be at work by 9. So I get home and have a bath. And let an hour or two pass. Drifting in front of my TV. When a film comes on that she wants to see, it's Monday morning 5:19, and I'm still wondering where she's been. 'Cause every time I try to call, I just get her machine. And now it's almost 6 a.m. and I don't want to try again. 'Cause if she's still not back, then this must be.
So that year, I noticed that they did some gigs. One of them, they supported one of my real favourite bands, My Life Story. Well, in the summer, they played a festival that I attended, actually, although I don't remember watching them. It was the Essential Festival in Brighton. Now, the headliners were the Levellers that I did watch, but also on the lineup which I did watch was My Life Story, Shed 7, and the Stereophonics.
Oh.
But they were
All
on
bands,
those
all
gigs,
bands that you're really keen on there.
yeah, massive, massive. And also in '97 they played at the Reading Festival as well.
So yeah, you get into 98, and that's when Untouchable made the top 20. However, as with a lot of bands that we speak to, when they get to a peak, something happens, and in this case, their record label, East West Records, who they'd been on since with Kinky Machine,
Yes.
East West Record dropped the band, and and China Records then signed them to try and release their debut LP, and that did get to number 21 in the UK
which is
chart.
good.
Interesting enough, they had quite a bit of success in Asia. So, for example, that first album, their self-titled album, that achieved double platinum status in South Korea. It actually got to number one, replacing Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On.
That is
So,
incredible, isn't it?
it's,
I read that they were going playing like little venues over here, and then they went over to South Korea, playing in massive halls, and they'd turn up at the airport and they had fans screaming. It's just like a completely different
right,
world. Yeah.
right. So we get to a stage where they seem to have some issues with the labels, and I think they were actually because of the personnel on in those labels. The sort of band was signed, but they were also dropped twice by Warner Records, which then had a knock-on effect to delaying the release of both their albums.
Yeah, so I looked at that as well actually because you mentioned about East West Records. So East West dropped them, China signed them, then Warner took over China. Then when they were under the Warner stable, they reassigned them to East West, who then immediately dropped them again. So they've got the reputation of being the band that got dropped by the same record label twice. Incredible.
Because actually, when you start to then look at their sort of timeline, they had a couple more singles in '98, "Dream Another Dream" and "Summer's Over."
Kamikaze seagull planes fighting over chip shop takeaway remains. When you're walking on the cliffs, you can't help thinking of how far down the sea is, and what if it should give. I didn't mean to bring you down. Summer's over, seaside town. She says we shouldn't have come so far. This seaside town, summer's over. Empty pubs echo with sounds. Jukebox selections that keep going round and round. And maybe rain is all we need.
"Dream Another Dream" got to 39, "Summer's Over" got to number 60. But they were touring with Duran Duran in that time, and as you've said, they played a number of festivals too.
Yeah, they actually, as well as Duran Duran, they supported several tours, including Echo Belly, Sleeper, and Echo and the Bunnymen. Like you say, they played quite a few festivals, including Glastonbury in '98 and V and T in the Park. But this is interesting. I saw one of the gigs they played at the end of the year in December. They supported a band called Spearmint. Do you know Spearmint?
No.
No, you see, it's really odd because they obviously were the head band, the lead band. Rialto were the second support, or the first support act. Sorry, the
Right.
one after that, the first band on stage were Muse.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so you got Muse, Rialto, and Spearmint. So that's incredible, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah.
As you start to get to the end of the '90s into the 2000s, they released this 6-track EP called "Girl on a Train," and that was actually quite well received with Enemy. And this is where you get this. Actually, they've got a bit of inconsistency with the critics. So, for example, for the EP, the Enemy said every song here could be a single. The title track is the most immediate. Louis Elliott's lyrics are crisp and clean. So very, very positive.
Yeah.
However, at that point, Toby Haunsham and Anthony Christmas, they both left the band, left them as a four-piece, and they
Okay.
then they came to get their second album, Night on Earth, in 2001, which interestingly enough, then Enemy were really scathing about. And then funny
So
you
what? So
mentioned,
they bigged up the previous EP, and then they were
yeah,
scathing about the album.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. Interesting you say about Muse being on the same bill as them, because
Yes.
NME was saying that, take note, Muse, for this is the fate that awaits you. It is with tender regret that NME has the privilege of reintroducing the world to the one and only poor pulp. Ladies and gentlemen, they're back. I mean, that's quite
Oh
brutal,
God.
isn't it?
Oh,
And
gutted.
and we've talked a few times, haven't we, about NME and the Melody Maker and sounds and how those music papers
Yeah.
were so influential. And a
Yes.
lot of the bands that we've spoken to have sort of said in today's world you can't comprehend how the impact that they had.
Yes. Yeah.
But Night on Earth, as I say, had mixed reviews. Enemy clearly didn't like it, but the Drowned in Sound website they did like it. So that they gave a very positive review. So
Right. Well, we said this before about Enemy with a lot of our podcasts. There's almost a thing about build them up, then knock them down again, and it's almost like a classic example of that, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. But so you then get to the point actually then in sort of end of 2001, 2002 when Rialto seemed to come to a bit of an end. Louis Elliott in 2002 released his first solo EP, Everybody Loves You When You're Dead.
Rich kids are born to hate the world. That's why they steal their mother's pearls. All that money makes you sick. Gotta find a way to get your kick. But you know it's really not his fault. And growing up can be so cold. Victim of a nursery crime. The mess your father left behind. The flowers were white and red. They laid them round the bed. The sun shone down, the hearse drove on ahead. Everybody loves you when you're dead, with a needle in your leg.
He then went on to he sort of had a bit of a meeting with the Roxy Music and Smith's producer John Porter, and that led him to some recording sessions. And then he actually then got what the Sunday Times album of the week when he
Wow,
released
brilliant.
his solo album, which was The Long Way Round, and that was in 2004. And he's toured, as a solo artist, he's toured with some incredible performers: Sinead O'Connor, Lloyd Cole, Robin Hitchcock, Proclaimers.
So I saw that he toured with Danny Goffey from Supergrass. Now, interestingly enough, Danny was in the band called Lodger, which was sort of Supergrass, kind of fell out of Supergrass as a side project. And Lodger and Rialto played together actually in 1988, and Lodger supported Rialto. So maybe he got to know Danny there.
So we then get into like the 2010s and pretty much since the beginning of the 2010s, Louis Elliott sort of toured as pretty much as a full-time member of Grace Jones's band.
Yeah. So actually, I saw that in November 23. They announced they were coming back. They're playing at the Shine On Weekender Festival. Now, actually, it's pronounced more like the way Liam Gallagher would say, Shine On. That's the pronunciation of it. And there's a festivals they have in Butlins, actually, Butlins holiday camps in the UK. And they get some massive acts on. I was just looking back at some of the posters for them. They've got like the likes of Happy Mondays, Ash, Teenage Fag Club, Cooler Shaker, Embrace, and the Billy Men. Loads of these bands, Peter Hawkwind stuff. All these different bands that were big in that era playing together as a big sort of festival. So they came back and played at that in November 23. So that was pretty cool. They then came back with a single called No One Leaves This Discotheque Alive. And they have a new album coming out in April this year, 25, called Neon and Ghost Signs. And they've got a whole tour sorted out. And they're also playing a bit with Sleeper once again. So that'll be interesting.
Yes, I saw that they were supporting Sleeper on that tour. So it's they're sort of a working band again. So be great to talk to Louis
Yeah, and ask them
about
all
that
about
sort
that.
of about that shift. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so why don't we do that? So Louis, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Can you just start for us then, perhaps giving us a little bit of a view about what your early influences were when you were growing up and as you started to get into music?
Like most people, I suppose, there's a lot of stuff that comes from your parents or, I was trying to think the other day what the first record I bought was. Somebody asked me actually, and it was this terrible 70s novelty record. I think it was called Black Superman. It was about Muhammad Ali. It was produced, I later found out, by the same guy that did Kung Fu Fighting. Very 1970s sort of. You won't want to listen to it. If you do listen to it, it will get stuck in your head and you'll wish you hadn't listened to it. I bought it off a friend of mine. So whether that was an influence, I don't know. But the first sort of contemporary stuff, my parents were playing stuff. My mum played a lot of things like Bob Dylan and Van Morrison
Cool.
and my dad played more things like Al Green, a bit of Sly and the Family Stone,
Brilliant.
more of a
Yeah.
sort of soul-y sort of side of things. And my mum's side of things was more of that sort of Neil Young and all that kind of thing.
All good,
So,
though. All good stuff. Yeah.
yeah, good stuff, really. Yeah, they weren't really Beatles. They weren't big on the Beatles. They were a bit, if they were going to be Beatles or Stones, it was definitely Stones. I think and I liked sort of 50s rock and roll stuff when I was very young. I think I had a friend who was into that, so I heard some of that, Elvis and stuff like that. But the first sort of contemporary thing that I really got into was bands like the Specials and the Beat and all of that sort of two-tone movement.
Yeah.
I fully got into that. And, I was lucky enough to go and see quite a lot of gigs when I was a kid through sort of, a friend of my mum's had a record shop and stuff like that. So I went to see the Undertones and I saw all sorts of things. I saw Hawkwind because they were sort of local to where we lived.
So that was supposed to be cracking live, Hawkwind. I mean, the whole sound with the bass and everything was supposed to be amazing.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was very of that sort of psychedelic kind of hippie sort of thing. But I actually was taught guitar by one of the members, one of the band members. So they were sort of friends, and we, we were going to see them. But the first things that I went to see, first gigs and stuff that probably without an adult around was like the Specials and that whole sort of thing. And then that developed into things, how it is when you're that age. There's new things come along quite quickly and you discover new stuff that you change week by week. Well, not week by week. You got your favourites, but Elvis Costello I got into a lot in my teens. His songwriting, I suppose, is still a bit of an influence. Don't like all of it, but I just think it's like a good mentor or a good tutor. You're like, God, okay, you can do that, you can do this. And I think things like The Jam, I remember hearing Move On Up by The Jam, that must have been 82 or something, 81, 82. Curtis Mayfield, I didn't know who Curtis Mayfield was, but I was like, what's this track? It's brilliant. Went to the record shop, the record and tape exchange. They didn't have the Curtis album, but they had an album called Back to the World, which I still love, which is but perhaps lesser known Curtis Mayfield record, but it's a fantastic record. Quite summery, a lot of it, in its sound, certainly that song, but it's actually about people coming back from Vietnam War and not having a place in the world, and sort of
Wow.
So quite an interesting kind of political record with a fantastic soundtrack backing this quite serious subject matter, and then just God, I'm trying to think of where it went from there. I think that led me into liking things like more stuff like Sly and the Family Stone, and alongside of that, there's the Clash and all psychedelic furs. There was a lot of, to me, it felt like there was a lot of good stuff around to get your ears around. I think I played in various bands, lots of bands prior to Kinky Machine and Rialto. I was like most people, just trying to find a vehicle that was sort of working, whether I was singing or writing or just playing guitar for people. Obviously most of them didn't work out. Some of those people have since become established, and it's amazing, to sometimes when I think, God, I was in a little band with them, and 20 years later they're doing it, you know.
How did you get from Kinky Machine to Rialto then? What was that journey like?
Kinky Machine began to feel like a bit of a straitjacket, because it was the demos that I made that got the record deal for Kinky Machine. I actually made them with quite a now successful songwriter called Egg White. We'd been in a sort of a band, a collective of musicians that used to play sort of one-off gigs. I met quite a few interesting people through that situation. Somebody invited me to be in it. We'd play All Souls Boxing Club on Harrow Road, or we'd play at the Maxilla Working Men's Club under the Westway, or we'd basically around sort of Ladbroke Grove, which is where my mum lived and I spent most of my upbringing. I met some interesting people through that. Charlie Charles from the Blockheads played drums in it for a little bit. Egg was playing bass. A guy called Tom Dixon, who's now a very successful furniture designer, played bass in it for a while. It was more like a collective. Different people would get up and sing a song, and it was mostly country music we were playing, covers, but it was really good fun. I made some demos with Egg, that got passed around. Somehow that ended up with somebody who got me a record deal. And then, though I'd been playing with some band members, the demos actually hadn't been made in that way. So then the Kinky Machine, the band, sort of grew up around me getting signed, really. I was like, okay, I want this guy, I invited the band to sort of come together, found the right members. But it became much more guitar-led, which I really wanted at the time. It felt really right, and it was exciting, and it was more live than the demos had been. But I think within a few years, we just found it was a bit of a straitjacket, the limitations of really just being a guitar band. In the studio we did used some keyboards a bit, but we did a couple of albums, but also we found that we hit a ceiling really with Kinky Machine. And the press, once you've been around, or certainly then, if you're on your second album and things hadn't really taken off, or you're sort of old news, so it was difficult to get the same amount of press. It was difficult to get on the radio. We couldn't break out of the indie sort of circuit. It looked like it was all over for Kinky Machine. We got dropped. We were about to get dropped, and incredibly, an A&R man called Ian Stanley, who had been a member of Tears for Fears.
Oh, right.
He's one of the sort of faceless members of Tears.
Yeah.
But was all over. He's on Everybody Wants to Rule the World and all of that stuff. Really lovely man, brilliant guy. He loved the band, and he was coming to see us play at Chelmsford Y Club or whatever. And it really felt like it was the end for Kinky Machine, but he wanted to sign us, which he did. And that started out pretty well, but we weren't. At the time, we'd lost our manager. We went off on tour. We did one single with Ian producing on East West, London Crawling.
London crawling through the sodium glow, just like lovers again, slipping between the sheets of dirty rain. London crawling through the sodium glow, just like lovers again, slipping between the sheets of dirty rain. Under the cover of the narcotic night, the streaming colours of the traffic lights, the two of us dreading the end, burning our money in a basement. London crawling through the sodium glow, just like lovers again, slipping between the sheets.
We went off on tour with Elastica actually in Europe, and the record came out, I think, whilst we were away. We didn't have a management. Nobody was directing the promotion of it in any way, so it did nothing. And then Ian just sort of said, "You know what, guys? I think you've got something really great here, but I think you need to take a bold move here and ditch Kinky Machine. Go away. I'll give you some recording equipment, and let's see what you come up with, and just let go of what you were doing before." Which was a slightly difficult decision to make, because you think, okay, we've got to a certain certain point, we're selling tickets to a certain amount of people, and we've done all this work, and now we're going to just start from scratch again. But it was the best thing. It was the best thing because it opened us out creatively. So Johnny and I from Kinky Machine moved over into this band that ended up being called Rialto.
That was a great bit of mentorship then from that guy, wasn't it? Really, really.
It really was. It was a bold
Yeah.
sort of thing, and he saw something in us. And I love the label that I'm on now, Fist Panda. But that was a sort of style of A&Ring that I'd never experienced before or since. Really, he was quite laid back, but you know, he wasn't all over us. But he just helped direct things and encourage what was good. Got us some equipment. Said, "Go away, come in every couple of weeks when you got a new tune." You know. We'd go in there, he'd be lying supine on his sofa, like, I don't know if he'd had a late night or what, but he'd sort of close his eyes and he'd listen and he'd give us the rundown on what he thought. And usually he was right. You know, he's not in the music business anymore, but I've got a lot of respect and gratitude towards that guy, actually. Yeah.
And where did Rialto come from, the name?
So the name was, we were demoing these songs and somebody said to me, what's the band? What's it like then? What sort of music is it? And I was like, it's so difficult to describe your own music. And I said, I don't know really. It's sort of, but I think it would sound great if we did a gig in an old cinema, like a dilapidated old theatre or something. That's the kind of environment. That's how I saw it. I just had this sort of visual idea of what the music was like. And she was like, oh, what, like the Rialto? I think there was one in Streatham or somewhere in South London.
Oh, right. It wasn't named after a bridge then in Venice. No.
It's not the bridge in Venice. No, it's a chain of cinemas.
Right. Okay.
And I was like, the Rialto, yeah. I thought, okay, that could be the name for us. And coincidentally, not long after that, I was reading a book about John Barry, one of the influences on the sound of the band. And oddly enough, John Barry had grown up. His dad ran a Rialto cinema in York. He was like the projectionist or whatever. And that had another link for me that I thought, wow, Rialto is great. You know, it suits the band. Little did I know that at that point that there's also a 3-wheeled car, like a Reliant Robin called a Rialto.
Oh, really?
Didn't quite fit the imagery in my head, but I quite like the humour of that anyway. So
that's brilliant. So I want to talk to you just briefly about the bit of the roller coaster part of the band's history. So you're with East West Records, and then they decide to drop you, and then you get picked up by China Records, and you think, right, life's sweet. Then China Records gets taken over by, I think, Warner, who then one of their imprints is East West, and they assign you back to East West. That must have been a real shocker to that whole process.
Looking back on it, I mean, I've always thought it was quite a sort of comedy scenario, really. You know, I never felt bitter about it, really, because I've always felt quite lucky to have got signed in the first place. And I like to think, well, yeah, we over the period of like 4 years or something, Rialto, I think, was signed and dropped. We were on 4 different labels, I think. But, you know, I just like to remind myself that we were signed 4 times in order to be dropped 4 times.
Yeah, good point.
And lots of people never get signed at all. So, but it was kind of ludicrous. Yeah, we were doing very well on the East West with this A&R man, Ian Stanley, and the other boss at the label loved the band. But as happens with it, I don't know for what reason, you know, things were going very well. We charted, we were getting on. And having been in Kinky Machine, it felt like we'd had a sort of bit of an apprenticeship, you know, of like how to do it. And we felt very happy at that label. We liked the people that worked there. We felt like they liked us. We got on with the press guys. We were having a great time. They were throwing money at us to make videos. We were working hard. We all thought we were going in the same direction. For whatever political reason, the boss at the label and Ian Stanley, our A&R man, were moved on. I don't know what happened, I don't know what happened, but there was a change of boss at the label. And I guess he just wanted to make his mark. My only real regret is that I never actually got a conversation with him. I was never in the room to say, like, what's this about? Because, you know, it seems like we were doing great, you know. And this isn't, you know, I've never felt that bitter, and I don't think I can't help quite wondering whether the same guy, he's called Rob Dickens, a very successful big record company guy. Some years before, when I was sort of in my late teens, I'd been given a development deal by an A&R man under Rob Dickens at one of the Warner's companies, I can't remember which it was. The A&R man loved what I did, Rob Dickens didn't. I kind of have questioned whether he's just was one of those sort of people that didn't like to be proved wrong. So I felt like maybe he was like, well, I've already said this guy's not got anything going on, and I've got the opportunity to move them off the label now. So anyway, whatever it was, he sacked us off the label, which was, looking back on it, well, at the time it was a bummer because there was great momentum with the band and everything seemed to be hunky-dory. So we went over to China, China, the label. But these things always take I think it maybe took us 6 months or whatever to get off the deal onto the new one. And that slows your momentum. So I don't think it really helped the band at all. I know it didn't. Then we made another record for China, and China was bought by East West. So it was like, we're back. Here we are again. And they shelved that for a while and then dropped us. So then we were on another label. So it wasn't the best luck that you could have had, but we had a good laugh along the way. It wasn't all bad. We got to travel, we got to play all over Europe, we got to, we did very well in parts of Southeast Asia, particularly South Korea. There were trips to Moscow. We had a great time, but it probably could have gone better, if we'd been lucky enough to keep the same A&R man we'd started with. I think things would have looked a bit different for the band.
It's a very familiar story that we've heard from a lot of the bands about, whether it's labels, managers, or lack of coordination and sort of providing direction.
And sometimes the press as well, isn't it? The press will build them up and knock them down again quite often as well.
Absolutely, and I think that the press was more. I think the press did that even more. Then somehow that was the press was a sort of ecosystem of its own, which existed. It had to sell papers. It had to blow something up and then knock it down, and that was how you kept selling the papers. And it was brutal. When I see some of the press, one or two reviews that I found it somewhere. I can't remember if it's on the internet or an old clipping, but it was absolutely brutal. The kind of things that people would not say now because they're sort of personal attacks. And thankfully, I think, although it was kind of fun to read that stuff sometimes, that culture it no longer exists really in the press, because generally press is like, these days I've found people are less likely to write about you. If they don't like you, they just won't give you the time, and that's fine. It's kind of better in a way than the brutality of some of the build them up, knock them down stuff that went on before. But hey, it's not this business. It's not a guaranteed easy ride. It just isn't. I think you've got to accept that when you get into it, and if you can sustain it, do it for those reasons that you started out doing it, which is about the buzz you get of creating something or making something and playing together with other people. And
because Night on Earth seemed to split the critics, didn't it?
Yeah, I don't really remember the reviews of that, but I think there was certainly, we'd had our initial, excitement or backing from the press, and then we got dropped however many times it was before Night on Earth came out. I personally, it's hard for me to look at that record, Night on Earth, and be completely objective about it, because honestly, I didn't like it as much. I didn't feel the record as much. And I think that happened slightly because the first record had a more organic sort of sound. Night on Earth, Johnny, who was my main partner in the band, I was writing the songs, Johnny was doing the production. And on the first album, there was I would say I was more involved in the production. The second album, Johnny got Pro Tools, and that was a new thing, and there was all sorts of bells and whistles to play with. For me, I was sort of writing the songs and then sitting at the back of the room whilst he was sort of working out how to use this gear. And for me, I think I shouldn't put my own record down, but I think it's got some good tunes on it, and it's probably aging all right. But at the time, it just felt it felt a little. Some of the humanity seemed to have got produced out of it because of the amount of processing or the amount of. But as far as the critics went, yeah, I think it did. I think it did divide critics, and I think it, the difficult thing with being on the end of reviews that you felt were knocked out in 20 minutes, half an hour, when you'd spent a number of years making something. That was a bit harsh. That could hurt a bit, because the critic's job was just to knock out a kind of, oh, I've just listened to this. It's a piece of shit. I don't know if you can say that, but or have some snidey comment about the band or something, and that maybe that's what made for good reading then. But I think it probably did split the critics. I think some people loved it, and some people probably just saw what had happened to the band, that we'd been dropped a couple of times, and just thought, okay, well, I can write about that in my review. I only got to knock out a few lines, half an hour, boom, Having said that, it still did very well in certain parts of the world. Southeast Asia, it was, platinum record. It was, we went out to Korea and did a load of stuff there again, South Korea. But yeah, I think it wasn't quite as received across the board quite as well as the first one.
So talking about South Korea, you obviously went from playing like just standard gig venues around the UK, like King Tut's, for example.
Yeah.
And then you were going out to South Korea to play in massive halls. But I read that you get to the airport and there'd be screaming fans waiting for you. That must have been twisted your melon, basically.
I mean, how great. Can you imagine? It was fantastic. It was a complete surprise. I didn't know really anything about South Korea before I went there. I really didn't, I don't think Google existed. I was like, I think they had the Olympics there. I really knew very little about the place, and we showed up, and there were literally screaming girls at the airport and stuff, and it was a massive culture shock. I think it was South Korea's kind of boom, or the South Korea that exists now was in its very early infancy then. It wasn't the place it is now, but it was this culturally very interesting, and to be received that well without really understanding, what on earth had gone on to make us successful in South Korea, we really didn't know. But what we did find was things like walking into we were staying in the fanciest hotel. You walk in, there's a sort of cheesy sort of lounge duo in the big reception hall sort of cocktail bar area, knocking out sort of Elton John tunes, and then suddenly they're playing Monday Morning 519 without realizing we were there. And just think, God, we've arrived in South Korea.
It's incredible.
They may throw stones against the glass, but there's no need to worry. One day they'll want our help and ask. We'll turn and say we're sorry. If all the stars fall from the sky and we have nothing to cling to, there'll always be you and I, and this is the song I'll sing you. You and me should stick together. We were built to last forever. Don't let go of your youth. If we don't run the race, then we can never lose. Shattered blue, because we know the truth. If we don't run the race, then we
Let's talk a little bit about your songwriting then. So, has it changed at all over the years, or do you still do the same things that you did back in the day?
You get it's a songwriting's there are certain skills you acquire and you get better at. It's a mixture of skills and inspiration and sort of artistry or whatever. Or I've got more of an understanding. I've always had a sort of analytical kind of approach to if I listen to music, I'm part of me. One ear is quite often going, oh, how do they do that? Oh, if I like something, I'm like, oh, that's cool. So I'm not formally trained. I had some guitar lessons from Lloyd Langton, who was in Hawkwind, but I know I've read some music books, theory books and stuff. So I've got, pretty good understanding because of my interest in how it all works, But has my songwriting changed? I think I know what I'm doing a little bit more, but you need that spark of inspiration, which might be about doing something that you don't quite understand why it works, or you somehow just, you're not doing something, but it rarely works if you write a song by numbers. I don't know if I've always known this, but I think a lot of great songs have a balance of familiarity and the unexpected. Maybe that's an obvious thing to say, but you need a certain amount of something that's easy, not too challenging to get your head round as a listener, but you also need a sort of wonk. You need some surprise in there, whether it's some sort of twist musically, something that could be lyrically. So as far as, whether it's changed the way I write, I don't really know. I don't have any recipe as well for writing. It's not, occasionally a song falls into your lap. On the whole, I find it quite a difficult process. I don't knock out songs every day. It amazes me, some people's kind of output. Paul Weller, I don't like everything he does, but he still comes out with these great things, and there's probably a lot of stuff I don't hear everything he does these days. I don't buy every record of his, listen to every record, but I'll hear tunes and just think, man, he's knocking stuff out, and he's just done another killer there, But I think I'm quite a perfectionist, so I will really hone things and spend a long time at getting a song finished, getting it right. One of the things that has changed about my songwriting is I don't chance getting away with stuff. I think I used to have, when I was much younger, a bit more of a well, I don't really know what that means. It sort of feels all right. I don't know what it means. They're not going to know what it means. They'll probably think it means something. I'm a harsh critic of my own work, a really harsh critic of my own work. Maybe that comes from early years of getting some brutal reviews sometimes, not always, but, Kinky Machine got some brutal reviews. And I probably still, somewhere in the back of my mind, I'm a bit like, well, you're not going to be able to say that about this one. And so they probably served me quite well in that way.
I think it's good that you've got the momentum on carrying on songwriting. So I was chatting with the lead singer of Hardfire, Richard, in a pub one time, and I was telling him I've always wanted to write a book, but I've never started because it's always going to be the most perfect book ever. And he just said to me, he said, just write something. Don't worry about what it is. Write something. Keep the momentum, and eventually it will build into something. And he said he mentioned a book that he'd read, which talks exactly about that, which I think was called the War of Art, instead of the Art of War, called the War of Art, which basically gives you that whole thing about keep the momentum up, and you've got that.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, it's really good.
I think that is so true, and that's one of the hardest things about making stuff is that a lot of it is rubbish. You'll write stuff down, you'll just go, well, I've got nothing to say. There's nothing there.
So talk to us a little bit then about the and I don't want to sort of rake over old ground, but the finish of the band and then perhaps what happened afterwards.
Yeah. So Rialto. Look, we had two drummers for a while. That was frankly an idea that probably should have stayed in the pub. But it was when things were going supremely well at East West, and Ian, the fantastic A&R man, was like, yeah, great, and there was money around. And so second album, we had to strip things back partly financially, just because we couldn't sustain everybody being paid properly to do, what we had to do. So the band stripped back to like a 4-piece, I think, for the 6-piece. We made Night on Earth. That was shelved. We did another EP called Girl on the Train, which came out as an internet only available via a website, which felt like this kind of incredibly futuristic thing at the point. You couldn't buy it in a record shop.
Late when she got on the train, found the space between the coffee stains, struggling to lift her suitcase, pushing back the hair from her face. Here in my seat, I feel the rush beneath my feet. She's just a girl on a train, I'll probably never see her again. The girl on the train, I never even asked her train. I wonder if she's feeling the same. She looks listlessly at magazines.
Just the scuppering of the momentum because of all this sort of hopscotch that we were playing with labels, slowed things down. And despite having the equipment to make a new record, because that was one of the things I think was probably quite clever of us, was to, rather than spend all the money the record label gave us, we weren't just going into expensive studios. We were buying bits of equipment and making a lot of the stuff around at Johnny's flat. But I can't really speak for Johnny, but I felt like it was maybe without the backing of a new record deal, we were sort of stalling. And then I went to New York, and there was some interest from a label, and I ended up demoing and doing some stuff for a solo record. I think it was partly because I think there was also between Johnny and I, there was a slight part of musical differences where the second Rialto album had got so sort of synth based and sort of keyboardy, and I was listening to things like Eliot Smith, and I don't know, I just had this calling to just be doing something that was way more organic and acoustic based. And so I ended up doing more, I started doing some gigs, and I met a producer called John Porter who'd worked with the Smiths and Roxy Music and stuff, and he really liked what I was doing, did some demos, didn't actually amount to anything, but it just set me on a path of doing something else really. I think I wanted to keep moving forward, and I think it maybe the band had the wind taken out of its sails, but I didn't feel like giving up in any way. So although it was a slow process, I just went on to doing little gigs, solo gigs, wherever it was. The Betsy Trotwood, I was playing to, 25 people in a pub, but I just felt like, well, I'm writing songs, I want to keep doing this. So we didn't fall out or anything. The band didn't fall out. It was just one of those things where it stopped having momentum, and we began doing other things.
Although that solo album did get quite a bit of, it was very positively received, wasn't it?
It was really well received. The thing is with the music business is you need all the right things to happen at the right time. And despite getting loads of very nice reviews, it was not on a proper label. It was on the management. Our managers basically put the record out. It didn't have the elements to take it to a wider audience. We didn't have a plugger taking it to radio. We didn't have all the things that, we didn't have any. There was no promo budget, really. It just so happened that it got to a few journalists who gave it some very, very nice reviews. I think it got Album of the Week in the Sunday Times, and it got some lovely things, but it didn't take it to a very wide audience.
So how did we then get to the reunion? Because that's obviously, I read something that were you unwell when you were in Spain?
Yeah, I was. Yeah. I mean, in the meantime, I made another record with a band I got together called the Embers, and I was based in Cornwall at that point, and I got a kind of local band together, and we were just playing pubs, and it had a very rural sound, accordion and mandolin, and quite different to Rialto. But writing those songs, I was like, well, what am I trying to do here? And actually, there was a local pub that had bands playing. It was a great atmosphere in that pub, and I was kind of like, well, if I can make music that goes down well in there, that's my aim right now. It wasn't on a big scale. It was just like, I just want a band that would go around and play gigs, maybe do some little festivals. And, and the Louis Eliot and the Embers album, again, it had no promo. It got a few great reviews, got a bit of radio with people like Radio 2 Folk Show and stuff. It's quite far from Rialto, but I think it's a good record, actually. But moving on, yeah, I was, in this sort of interim period of 20 years between the Rialto records, I was also playing guitar for Grace Jones, which I still do. And then, yes, I got ill. I came off the back of a Grace Jones gig, and I've been not really looking after myself. I ended up in hospital in Spain. I won't go into the details of it, but I had a very close call. I think having your sort of mortality suddenly right up in your face, realizing that it could have gone another way, I might not have survived. As it was, I'm absolutely fine now. But I think it made me think about making some changes in my life. Not all the most obvious ones, but I guess in a broad, it wasn't like I woke up from the, surgery and was like, I've got to start Rialto again. It wasn't like that. But I think it just set me on a slightly different path. I moved back to London. I don't know. And I just started writing these songs. With songwriting, I think I'm quite influenced by my surroundings. And maybe that's even something that, perhaps I don't know if I picked it up from sort of like, loving the Clash as a kid, that they sort of mythologized their, wherever it was, they sort of, they could make the West Way sound glamorous.
Yes, true.
And I think that being in Cornwall, I soaked up that environment and wanted to, and wanted the music just somehow reflected that part of my life, that where I was living. And so moving back to London full time and my kids getting older and stuff, and me being a bit freer to be just experiencing some stuff that I hadn't done so much of for a number of years. It was just about being out and about, really. And I was writing these songs and certain people were sort of like, I'd be, play the odd demo and people were like, well, that's Rialto. That's not Louis Eliot and the Embers, is it? That's, I genuinely feel that it's picking up where I left off with Rialto, but there's been a lot of intervening years, which means that there's a lot more experience and there's musically a broader palette because of things I've done, like playing with Grace Jones. There's probably a little bit of influence from her on there in a subtle way, but some of it's a bit groovier than things that were on the first Rialto album. There's maybe a sort of dark disco-y sort of element into a few songs, and perhaps that's partly Grace's influence.
So I was going to ask you, you co-wrote Shelter You with Tarka Cordell,
Yeah.
and after he passed, you recorded it with Lily Allen for a tribute album to his life. And I know that Johnny's also wrote stuff for Lily as well. So what was it like working with her?
Lily's a very, as probably anybody, whether they know or not, can see, she's a sort of multifaceted personality. I've known her a bit socially since before she blew up. So it was pretty easy going, doing that. We went down to her place when she was living in somewhere in the Cotswolds. She had this fantastic place. Really easy, fun, laid back thing to do. She was fun and easy to work with, and Lily's cool. She had one of those segways, which I'd never, you don't really see them about much now, but they were mind blowing.
If you go to Prague, you can't walk anywhere for them.
Right.
Yeah.
My kids had never seen one before, and I don't think I'd seen one in real life before. And my daughter was quite taken with it. Lily had one. I'd never met anyone else who had one. It was this new thing. Anyway, she gave it to my daughter. She's,
Wow.
she was like, no, you've got to have that. You love it. She was, it was cool to work with her. She knew Tarka as well. Tarka was a childhood friend of mine. His dad was close to my dad. In fact, the guitar that I use now was something that belonged to him and his brother gave me after he died. So I think, the reason for doing it, we had a mutual reason for doing it because we both knew him and felt close to him.
So we asked this question of everybody, which is, if you look back now, what would you say is your favourite memory so far?
There are lots, and there are lots of great things that happened that I can't remember. But I think early on with Rialto, one of our singles, Untouchable, which ended up being, we did on Top of the Pops. It was a proper hit and everything. I wrote it. I thought it was cool when I wrote it, and then the record company wanted to do it as a single. And by that point, sometimes you get a bit over familiar with a song and think, so it's like, I don't know if that was like that cool. It doesn't feel edgy enough. It feels too whatever. Somehow I just kind of wasn't that into the song, but the record company wanted to release it. And I think we were on tour, queuing up in a service station to get some fast food from a well-known fast food emporium, which I won't name. And it came on the tannoy speaker or whatever. And I was like, this is great. This song is killer. So I think that, those sort of memories of like pulling up at the traffic lights and hearing your song coming out the car radio from the car next to you was a really like, okay, this is the stuff of, your kind of childhood dreams is actually happening, you know. So yeah, I think I still sort of I don't think I'll ever forget those moments. Yeah.
Well, Louis, look, we're so glad you're back, and I'm glad you're back on tour later on this year with Sleeper. I don't know if they're mates of yours, but
Yeah, we toured with them way back when. They're lovely people. I'm really looking forward to that. We've got some other gigs. We've got our own gigs. We're playing a load of in-stores, rough trade shops around the week of album release. You know, which is going to be fun because I think we'll do that not as a total full band setup at all of them. So they'll be slightly different, be more like an unplugged version.
that's
Great
brilliant.
stuff.
No, so really good luck with the album. But thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.
Nice one.
Back when she was a girl, there was a plan to see her through her life, get married, settle down, and have some kids and be a good housewife. But she would go to bed at night with day-glow stars and fairy lights stuck on the ceiling of her room that she dreamt of another life. Now it's too late to go back home. It's saccharine and silicone for a broken Barbie doll. It's sleeping pills and alcohol, a night she'd rather not recall. For a broken Barbie doll.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Now, as you know, we do our research from a variety of sources, but if you want to add any more detail for us or even correct us on anything, then please do get in touch with us. Where can they get in touch with us, Noel?
They can contact us on our email address, which is unchartedsoundspodcast@gmail.com.
And of course, you can also get in touch with us on our Facebook group, the Uncharted Sounds group, as well as our Facebook page, the Uncharted Sounds page. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.